What's up, everyone? Today we're going to dig into whether there is any reason for me to have 3 different horns. The easy answer to this question is no, and I actually don't plan to keep 3 horns in sort of my locker of instruments. However, I did recently make an equipment change, and so I thought it might be useful to just do a short lesson about how I arrived at this point. I am not someone who's ever been a real big believer in that gear is going to solve my problems, but there is a place for making an equipment change under kind of certain circumstances, and there are certain things that your equipment can help you accomplish as a player. A few disclaimers before we start this lesson. First of all, my goal in this lesson is to help you with the process of deciding when to buy a horn and how to make that choice. Not really to tell you what instrument to buy. This is a super personal choice for all of us. Some players like the way certain instruments feel. Other players like the way other instruments feel. We can both be potentially right. It's very individual to our face and our musical needs. So you can certainly check out the instruments that I'm talking about today. All 3 of these are great instruments, but by no means is this sort of like a video that is recommending one horn over another horn. To get started, I'm actually going to play the same piece on all 3 of these instruments. The first 2 A sections to the ballad, Polka Dots and Moonbeams. I thought that would be a great way to kind of accurately represent the sounds of each of these horns, just playing a nice pretty melody. I'll quickly cut between all 3 instruments and labels so you can hear how each one sounds. I've got my regular Bach 36 that I've been playing on for a long time, a large bore Bach 42 with a Hagman valve, and then my new horn, which we'll get to what that is later in the lesson. All right, so some of those differences are pretty subtle. Now, admittedly, when I recorded this, I didn't sort of EQ it in any way that would sort of accentuate the differences in the horns. I just did sort of a low cut to get rid of any extra kind of garbage in the sound, a little bit of a scoop in the mid-range, right around 500 hertz to kind of get rid of some of the room, and then a little bit of boosting around 10K. The microphone I use is a ribbon microphone, and so sometimes it could be a little overly dark and needs a little bit of boosting in that kind of high frequencies just to make it open up a little bit. But that was it, and I did the same thing to all 3 horns just to give sort of a generic EQ so it would be on the same footing for each one. So, as I mentioned, I actually just made an equipment change. I've been kind of in this process really since right before COVID started, and then have been, taking a little hiatus through most of COVID, but here, in the fall of 2021, it was time to get back to this because I still felt it was something that was appropriate for me. So let's talk a little bit about my journey, about why I made this decision and how this can help you make your decision. For the last 7+ years, I've been playing on this instrument. This is a straight Bach 36. This is a great horn. It's been a wonderful horn for me to play on over the last 7 or so years. This instrument was kind of my first adult choice as a trombonist. Through my sort of mid to late 20s, I was really just playing on the instruments I played in college, as I think many people do, which was a 2B and then a 42BO, so just a standard open wrap Bach 42. And they were both fine, but as I was getting to kind of my late 20s, early 30s, there were just some things that I found I wasn't liking about those horns anymore with the way my playing was happening. And so I went on a little bit of a search then, and almost immediately when I started playing a Bach 36, it was bam, something just clicked. It was just the sound I was looking for, the response I was looking for. So this brings us to reason number 1 that you should consider making an equipment change. And that is if you know you're playing better, and you know what you need from an instrument based on that knowledge. I think a lot of us will run into this as we're sort of at transitional points in our playing, maybe coming out of college, especially a couple years after college, and you have a little bit of time to sort of process some of that information and know what you need out of a horn. Maybe as you get a little closer to middle age, as I am quickly approaching, maybe your physical needs change a little bit, or the type of music you're playing changes a little bit. And so once you know your needs better, you can better make a choice of an instrument that matches those needs. So even though I said I'm actually moving away from this horn being sort of like my daily driver, I still love this horn, and there's a lot of things that it does really, really great. In particular, it is really great at playing loud and aggressive. It really, really rips when you want it to. When I first started playing this instrument, I was playing in a number of kind of salsa or Afro-Cuban bands, and I needed that like big, fat sound for those ensembles. So let's check out a little bit of an example of that kind of style. This is the Willie Colon tune, Idilio, and just a classic salsa tune. I'm gonna play a little bit of the solo up front on this tune, so let's check it out. So I started playing on that horn maybe in 2014 or maybe even late 2013. I can't quite remember. But fairly recently, actually just in the winter of 2021, I really came to the decision that I needed to get back into having a big horn in my locker. So I don't talk about this much on this channel, but I actually live in Omaha, Nebraska, which is kind of a funny place to be a professional musician, but I moved here in 2017. My wife got a wonderful job opportunity, and that pulled us out here, and I've been able to carve out a nice amount of work as a player and teacher here. But pretty much since moving here, I found myself in pretty regular need of a horn with a trigger. A lot of this revolves around pit orchestra work for me, but then also some classical music as well. You know, I don't perform a ton of classical music, but every once in a while I do get that call where I really need this horn. For example, just this spring, did a handful of shows with the symphony, and I was playing third. And so it's not really going to make a ton of sense for me to play the 36, even though it's a medium bore horn, if the second and first players are playing large bore tenors. It's just not going to work in the section as well. And so I really decided, you know, it's finally time that I get back into a big horn. This brings us to reason number 2, why you should think about an equipment change, or in my case, an equipment addition, is if the work you're doing really requires it. For me, since I primarily play as a jazz musician and play in rock bands and that type of stuff, I usually play a straight horn that's, you know, a little on the smaller side, or in my case, this 36, which is a medium bore. So I needed to maybe add something that was a large bore horn with a trigger for those settings. If you're somebody who mostly plays, you know, kind of a big horn for your kind of daily driver, you might need to think about adding a smaller horn, particularly if you think, wow, I'm getting a lot of calls for big band gigs. You certainly don't have to play a small horn in a big band, but it can make your life easier in certain ways, particularly if you want to invest the practice time on that small horn, which you should, so you can improve your intonation, response, all that kind of stuff. You're going to blend with the section better, particularly if you are playing lead. It's just going to make your life a lot easier. So if you have that work lined up, you might want to make that investment. It really does make sense. So the question might be, well, Sean, what does this horn do well? Well, obviously it plays classical music for the most part. That's the biggest thing that I use it for. And so let's hear me just play a little bit of the opening of Grandal. You know, I am not a great classical trombone player, especially as a soloist. You know, I'm sort of serviceable professional player, but let's see how I do on the big horn playing just a little bit of this solo. Cool. Now, the other thing I really love this horn for is actually to teach on. Most of my students who I teach locally here are just taking trombone lessons from me. They're not taking like jazz trombone lessons, some of them are. And so most of them are really working on playing in all-state, playing in solo and ensemble festivals, and most of them are playing on concert tenors. And so it's great to have the horn to model sound to them. And also a lot of times by the time at the end of the day, I've practiced for a couple hours, I'm teaching for a couple hours, you know, my face just feels like a little bigger mouthpiece, a little bigger horn, feels a little more comfy to teach on. Okay, finally, that brings us to my new horn. That is probably going to be my new sort of daily driver, and the horn that I play the majority of my practice on and the majority of my gigs on. A few years ago, I started to become a little bit displeased with where my sound was on my Bach 36. This was particularly true when I was playing jazz and playing in a little bit quieter settings. As I said, it's great at really ripping, but when I wanted to be a little more sensitive, I just found that the sound was a little too spread out, not focused enough, and didn't have a little bit of like brilliance on it, a little sparkle that I was looking for. After a fair amount of practice to try to address some of these issues, and still not getting the results I was looking for, that's when it told me this is really time to maybe make an equipment change. I've been playing on this horn for quite a while and just my needs had changed. This led me on a little bit of a journey through trying some different horns. I tried a handful of things before sort of COVID hit, and then have tried some more things here in the summer and fall of 2021, and eventually settled on this instrument. This is a Courtois AC 402 rose brass bell, standard weight slide. And I'm finding that it really is giving me what I'm looking for from a sound and a response perspective. This brings us to reason number 3 why you should think about making an equipment change. If the sounds you're hearing in your head no longer match the sounds that are coming out of your bell. Now, this is clearly the trickiest thing to figure out because most of this just revolves around our practice. So often I think players think that the horn is going to help with their range or help with their intonation or help with like playing fast. It's not going to do those things. The things that can help you with a little bit of shaping your sound, this horn, for example, has a different material on the bell, different crooks, all that type of stuff than the 36 does. So it does definitely sound a little bit different and respond a little bit different, but those things are really minimal, maybe the final 10% of my sound. This could also be, included in the mouthpiece, all these things we talked about today. The horn can help you with response a little bit. Different horns respond differently. Where the articulation sits, kind of like where the note starts, can feel different on different instruments. But the majority of that comes from our practice. If we don't practice long tones, we don't practice lip slurs, none of that will matter just going to a different horn. So make sure to be really thoughtful about are the changes I'm looking for something that is in me and I need to practice, or the changes that I'm looking for is something that the horn can help with. Okay, so the question is, well, what does this horn sound like? And what does this do well? Well, I play in quite a few rock bands, cover bands, wedding bands, and so I wanted something that had a little more compact and focused sound for those settings. So let's just hear a little bit of that. This is the Lionel Richie tune, All Night Long. There's a great little horn shout section at the end. Additionally, as I already mentioned, I really wanted something that I felt more confident in my sound when I was playing in jazz settings, particularly when I wasn't playing quite as loud. And this horn, I've really been happy with what it's giving me in that area, especially with the quickness of response. Cool. So that takes us through kind of my journey of right now where I am with my horns. As I said, I've never switched a lot between different gear. I tend to like to stay on the same horn for a while, but I'm really loving the way this is playing now, and hopefully this will serve me through, at least the next 5 and hopefully longer years of my career. The last thing I will leave you with is when you do make a switch, whether that be the mouthpiece or the horn, don't look back. All of us have that really great honeymoon period when we first get a new horn. The first couple of days it's yeah, this is it, this feels great. And then maybe a week, 2 weeks in, all your problems are there waiting for you again. This is really typical. All brass players can attest to this. And so what you start to do is you start to second guess your choice. And you start to be like, maybe I shouldn't have moved away from that 36. Oh, maybe I shouldn't have moved away from that mouthpiece. And then you start kind of fiddling and tinkering, and then you're just down a rabbit hole. And you don't know where the focus is, you don't know where the response is, you don't know where the sound is, and you end up sounding worse than where you started. So when you make that change, be confident in that initial impression. When I first switched to my 36, it was immediate. I immediately knew this horn was what I needed. When I played this horn, immediately it stood out from the other ones I was testing as, ooh, this horn plays. trust that, and then put in the practice time so that when you are in the weeds, maybe 1 to 2 weeks out of the new horn, you can work through that period and end up on the other side in better shape than where you started. All right, we'll see all of you in the practice room.